When former Ethiopian President Haile Mariam Desalegn unexpectedly resigned on February the 15th, Ethiopia was plunged into a state of uncertainty. Declaring a 6-month state of emergency and imposing military law the following day has done nothing to ease unrest and concern. Ethiopia is undergoing its biggest change since the downfall of dictator Mengistu Haile Mariam. Central to the current unrest is who will replace Desalegn as the next president. Join us as Africa Today discusses if Ethiopians are on the verge of having leadership that will represent all her people.
Fired in Africa. It wasn't enough for Trump to insult African countries with racist comments. This time, despite his allies in Africa preparing to welcome his Secretary of State, he cut the tour short and called Rex Tillerson back to Washington. The US is Ethiopia's largest international backer and is leading the diplomatic charge to contain the current state of emergency in Ethiopia. On Tillerson's recent visit to the country, he ironically urged the Ethiopian People's Revolutionary Democratic Front to create more freedom, not less. Despite lacking trust from Ethiopians, the US has a strong economic investment hold on the country, pinning much of its military war on terror strategy on Ethiopia remaining stable. The catalyst for the country's rapid changes has been growing unrest over the EPRDF's running of the country. Protesters say the ruling coalition doesn't represent the interests of non-Tigrayans, who comprise about 94% of Ethiopia's 106 million population. The ruling coalition was created in 1989 when the Ethiopian People's Democratic Movement united with the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front. In 1991, they defeated ruling dictator Mengistu Haile Mariam and have ruled Ethiopia with an iron fist ever since. Now that grip looks like it is unraveling. There have been increased tensions, political and economic marginalization, civilian deaths at the hands of security forces, and refugees fleeing to Kenya. The EPDRF convenes to elect a new leader in mid-March, but Ethiopia's state of emergency continues.
Hello and a warm welcome to Africa Today. I'm Vuislang Ngobongwana, here to take a closer look at how Ethiopia might heal divisions based on ethnic lines. Joining me are journalist Tete Kofi and editor-in-chief of the Trumpet newspaper, Femi Okutubo. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
On the one hand, it should be an exciting time. On the other hand, it's a terrifying time. How do you assess the situation?
Well, just like you said, it's a mixed basket. Yeah. But I think it's, a very unfortunate, time in Ethiopia, considering that there had been a previous state of emergency that started in 2016, October, and was only lifted in August 2017. And barely 6 months down the line, purportedly there's yet another state of emergency. The reality is the issues haven't been resolved. There is so much unrest in the land, and it doesn't look good for the country. Right,
right. I mean, just how bad is the unrest from what you can assess it?
Well, from what I see, there is a fundamental problem in that the Oromo people, who form something like 33–35% of the population, are just not given sufficient representation in government. And the government of Ethiopia is still very much led by the Tigrayan elements of the party,
which is about 6% of the population.
Certainly under 10%. Yeah. So there has been this continuous drip of pressure against the government to let go and let the Oromians have a say in government. And I don't think that that pressure is going to go away.
Right, right. And it is an ethnic issue that isn't peculiar to Ethiopia. But as you see the government and how they've been behaving, would you say they're in control?
They're definitely not in control because, for example, if they've actually said, okay, they've declared a state of emergency, you can't do this, you can't do that, and the opposite is actually happening, they're definitely not in control. So, for example, you know, the protests have continued. There's been a social shutdown. Shops were not open, and so on and so forth. So, definitely, you know, it's one thing to sit in the corner of government office and say that this is what you want to see, but the reality in terms of people's power and in terms of what the people do is totally different. Right. And it shows that government is just not in control.
What is worse is that there is evidence to suggest that actually this state of emergency is unconstitutional because you need a certain level of vote, I think 2/3 of the vote to bring about a situation. And actually the government didn't have enough votes. And it declared the correct voting pattern and then realized that it didn't have enough votes to make this state of emergency legal. And so it then declared a completely different set of voting results. Yes. All of this looks bad, and as Femi's saying, this is not a government that's in control.
But I mean, it seems like they can pretty much manipulate it any way they wish. And as you mentioned earlier, they are a big player within the African continent in terms of future investment, particularly for Western interests. So do you think the confidence comes from feeling shored up by foreign support?
I don't see you know, the Western world having much confidence in what is happening in there. Obviously, they have an interest, and obviously they would want to do the best they can to sort of protect those interests. Yes. So apart from economic interest, obviously there's also the role that Ethiopia is playing in terms of you know, the militancy or the counter-militancy strategies. But
I was just going to ask you, what specifically are the interests? Are we talking resources here, or are we talking about strategic placement in the so-called war on terror?
I would say it's a combination of both. It's definitely a combination of both. The West has always, you know, had economic interest in there, and then obviously in terms of the positioning of Ethiopia, in terms of trying to sort of counter terrorism in that area. Don't forget that this is a country in the eastern region of the continent, and obviously when you look at countries like Somalia and, you know, the challenges of terrorism and so on, obviously Ethiopia is very well placed geographically in terms of these efforts.
But what is also interesting is that the narrative that we're putting through now is the narrative that has always existed. We got foreign investors, they're going to put money into the country, so just shut up and take it. Whatever's going on, however unjust it is for your people, you need the jobs, you need the development, so take it. Here's the thing. I think Africa is changing. I think every single African country is changing. And I don't think that these narratives are going to fly anymore. And it's actually quite perceptive, I would say, for programs like Africa Today to examine the possibility of this change of mindset. Because I actually don't think it is no longer sustainable.
Well, you know, you can compare it to what's happening a little bit further north in Egypt. You know?
Egypt, West Africa, East Africa, Southern Africa. I mean, there's this terrible thing that's going on in the Congo at the moment. And so Africa is like, the problems of one African country are like an illness that they quickly infect the next country. And so, but the positive side of that is that when one country wakes up to what's going on, it quickly starts to infect other people. And so even though there is the iron fist, which definitely exists.
Absolutely, yes.
See, as long as Ethiopia, I think they have enormous oil natural gas reserves, don't they? It's one of the greatest natural gas reserves in the whole of Africa. As long as they've got that, their people will survive.
Right. Well, when you say their people will survive, but it's under what conditions their people will survive? Will they tolerate having their point of view not being represented yet again? I mean, after that dictatorship of Haile Mariam, I think there could be a push that moves things differently, as Ted was just saying, that it will not play out like it has before.
It definitely wouldn't. And I think what is also important to bear in mind as well is that because there have been examples of successful people's uprisings, you know, where the people have actually gained at the end of it all, it's been a motivation for, you know, the people to actually be persistent. Yes. Again, when you look at technology, when you look at the role of social media and so on, because yes, it's easy for the government to say, okay, we're going to sort of, you know, try and clamp down on the press. But social media is even a very stronger and bigger tool that is being used, which cannot even be controlled by the government.
Right, right. Even though attempts are being made to do so, you know. But as we look at the various reports and studies on development, Ethiopia is still the largest recipient of donor aid. You know, despite having an economy that's been supposedly growing at a rate of 10%.
Right.
Every year. Yes. So there's a disconnect. Yes. Are we just talking about the usual pyramidal unequal relations economically, or is something else going on?
Well, I mean, there's this whole idea of kind of trickle-down economics, where if you create a lot of infrastructure, everything will automatically trickle down. It won't happen. We know that it never happens. And so those figures are great for actually attracting further inward investment from other investors. But that has nothing to do with the welfare of the people on the ground. Right. And this is what I'm saying, that a time has come, a time is coming, when actually ordinary Africans are going to say, do you know what? Yeah. I'm not going to sit here and be a football for Mr. Trump in America, Mrs. May in London, to play games with our future and our welfare at their convenience. Right. I think that time is actually slowly approaching.
Well, it's certainly being expressed all over the internet, and not just the internet, perhaps even in villages that don't get mentioned on the news. But we certainly know it's being expressed on our social media pages, because here are your comments. Let's hear what you've been saying. Our first comment comes from Hillary in the US. Hillary says, "May we understand that the government released prisoners as cover for further deprivation of human rights on a more massive scale." Do you both agree with that?
Well, they released 6,000 people who had been detained. It's obviously a way of buying some kind of credit, but I don't think it's been successful, because the people in Oromo are still asking for better representation.
It seems like a Pandora's box was opened. Okay, they let these people out, and then not long after, a state of emergency is imposed that restricts their ability to express themselves.
Absolutely, because when you look at the state of emergency as well, just as has been said earlier, even the whole process is faulty. And as far as most activists are concerned, you know, it's null and void, because the proper representation in terms of having the 2/3 majority in the House has not happened. Again, there are other issues. You know, there's the issue of the ethnic, the issues as well in terms of ethnic balance, and the fact that, okay, one region seems to be dominant, even though there's a much bigger region, which is almost 6 times the one that is actually dominant in government.
Right. Well, let's just clarify for you viewers that the EPRDF is composed of 4 political parties divided along ethnic lines: the Tigrayan People's Liberation Front, known as TPLF, the Amhara National Democratic Movement, ANDM, and the Oromo People's Democratic Organization, OPDO, and the Southern Ethiopian People's Democratic Movement. Now, that's a lot of movements, seemingly representative of the whole of the country, but in practice it obviously seems that the Tigrayan element seems to dominate in practice. And let's move to our second comment in Ethiopia this time. Mohammed says the capital city, Addis Ababa, is playing the main role in hiding and burying Oromo freedom. Oromo people are suffering the isolation, and they do not deserve it. Actually, everyone is suffering, especially children in Addis Ababa. So we need a national solution for all our problems, and it must be led by Addis Ababa. Well, obviously centrally, but it doesn't seem that there's a will to do that. Let's move to our next comment from Daggy, who says the state of emergency undermines recent positive steps towards creating a more inclusive political space, including the release of thousands of prisoners and, our security forces' merciless use of force. Another thought from Egypt is from Sisai, from Ethiopia, sorry. Sisai says, what was the point of this state of emergency? It's not going to make the problems go away. It won't silence us who oppose the government, and it won't silence the Oromo. At best, it will give us time to regroup and think of new strategies making us stronger. What happens in 6 months? We'll just come back. And anyway, the UN is already probing for investigations into the crackdown. So in the end, the government is losing. Do you really think the government is losing when the UN is known to support, well, stability at any cost?
Actually, that's a remarkably excellent note, because it's described exactly what's going on in the country.
Yes.
Resistance by the government seems futile. This is where I always feel as if something has been set in train, and anybody who actually tries to put that change back in its box is running against the course of history.
Right.
This thing will play out.
And the strong oppression of the Oromo people that's been alluded to in a couple of comments here. They are, in terms of representation, in terms of their numbers, a high percentage, but the military arm seems to have a very strong impact on their ability to freely express themselves.
The reality is, yes, you may look at it that way, but more importantly, you need to bear in mind as well that you can only silence people to an extent.
Yeah.
People are bound, to find their voice.
Precisely, particularly as you alluded, Ted, to the interconnectedness, the joining of the dots that people are making, literally politically educating themselves from their own front rooms and bedrooms.
You see, it was actually in West Africa. It was the day when the president, the current president, was adjudged to have lost a nailed-on election win.
Yeah.
And he withdrew and waited for another 4 years. Was the day I realized this country has changed and it'll never be what it was before.
Right.
And the country came together and accepted this situation. 4 years later, he got into power. So the process of change actually isn't something that happens dramatically through the point of a gun and so on.
Yeah.
People are experiencing these things every single day, and ultimately they come to a point. They come to a point of view, and they agree that this can't continue. And very strange it is that it doesn't matter how powerful the foreign backers are, it's very difficult for them to actually go against that.
And we did, of course, viewers, want to get the point of view of the Ethiopian government, but despite repeated requests, we were not able to secure someone to come and give their point of view. But we've certainly heard your point of view on our Facebook fan pages. Thank you so much for your contributions. It's much, much appreciated. And of course, we'd like you to keep those comments coming in. So if we could move on to perhaps rounding up how this may end. I know we're talking about scenarios that we can't be 100% accurate on, but as we look at the trends as it evolves, do you think that Ethiopia is actually going to manage to keep itself stable enough in the next crucial 6 months? Keep itself at least physically stable enough for its people to find a solution that avoids more violence? I don't know what
Yemi thinks, but for me there are two sides to this thing. There's the side of the population and there's the side of the government. Both elements are growing and developing. It's a question of how quickly the government learns that what is going on is unsustainable. And so, as far as I'm concerned, it could well happen that there'll be more crackdowns, there'll be more Oromians, the 6,000 who were let out, they could be rearrested and thrown back in jail. The whole process will go on. However, it's a zero-sum game. We all know where this is going. It is unsustainable. And so they are going to have to let go and find democratic representation.
What do you think they may let go on, Femi?
Well, I see a positive outcome at the end of the day in all of this, because I think, again, when you look at the case of the fact that the Prime Minister actually resigned, that is something that is almost, untold of or unheard of in Africa. And I think that the mere fact that he has decided to put the interest of his people or the country,
Do you think he really has done that, or he's done that to stall a situation that was coming anyway? Well,
again, we know of leaders who have decided that no matter what, till they're actually pushed out. We saw what happened in a place like Gambia, for example. So he had a choice of not leaving. But the reality is he has taken that step. Even before then, people that had been in detention were being released. Yeah. So again, an indication that we want some progress in the country.
Well, he's certainly getting encouragement on the diplomatic front, particularly from the US. I'm sure they're whispering in his ear on strategies to minimize the cracking within society.
No, sure. They would say that, wouldn't they? But again, I think that the average Ethiopian is going to be quite wary, actually, of the part played by foreign playmakers in that region.
There's a high level of political education from what I can analyze. And the US does not have a good record in terms of how Ethiopian people view them. And who knows, there have been even some reports speculating that it was the US who said, release those prisoners, let off some steam before you hold an election. Yes. Is that too cynical a point of view, or is that closer to the reality?
Nothing is impossible. So it's quite, I would say it's closer to the reality.
Yeah.
Because again, they're looking at their interests as well. They want peace. They feel that that's probably one way of attaining peace in the country, and at least making sure that their own interests are not at stake.
And of course, not forgetting the huge strategic importance of Ethiopia in the so-called war on terror.
Oh, absolutely, yes, it's massive. Very, very, very important. But you see, here's the thing. I always find it somewhat laughable when people are riding the back of a tiger and they think they're in charge of the tiger. They actually think they're in charge of the tiger. But actually, when the tiger realizes what its situation is, things can...
realization seems to be the key in terms of the spread of communication and information, because that's something that's really been stomped on, isn't it, Femi?
Absolutely.
You're a newspaper editor. No newspaper editor in Ethiopia currently feels free.
Sadly. And the earlier, the government realizes that both the government and the people are partners in a democracy. It's not a one-sided equation. The better for the country, and that's the reality.
Exactly, and perhaps one of the legacies of Ethiopia never having been formally colonized might be that. Maybe may spring out.
We shall see.
Time will tell.
And we live in hope.
And I'm afraid that is all the time we have. But we will, of course, update you on this rapidly evolving situation. Many thanks to our guests, Tete Kofi and Femi Okutubo. And thanks to you for your support in watching us. Do keep those comments flowing in on our social media Facebook page. More world news coming up next here on Press TV. Do stay tuned.